All right, so welcome back. We're halfway through, so we're clear sailing. We're already, you know, we've crested the hill. Now we're coming down. We're ready to finish up. We got two more videos. In this video, what I want to talk about is internal validity and threats to internal validity. In the second video, I'm going to talk about a different kind of experiment called within subjects. All right, so let's go. So we've talked about covariance, we talked about temporal precedence and the need to design your study so that that you're forming groups and things like that. But we also want to really make sure that the internal validity is good. We want to make sure that what we are measuring is in fact what we say we're measuring. That what we're measuring is in fact the independent variable's influence on the dependent variable. And that is really, really, really tough. It is really, really hard to do. And the reason for that is because we can only control humans so much. And what I mean by that is that whenever somebody comes into the laboratory and they're being studied, like let's say, so I do research with caffeine and I do research with attention and things like that. But you know that all of us have different backgrounds with caffeine, different backgrounds with attention. There's a lot of individual differences with attention. I can't coop you up and force you to live a certain way where you don't have any coffee whatsoever and that you practice good attentional hygiene or whatever. And so I can't control your behavior all that much, right? And because of that, that makes psychologists' jobs pretty difficult because there's lots of room for confounding variables to affect our results and us not even know about it. So we have to be very, very careful to look at ways in which confounds might influence our results. Because if they do, then we can't accurately say the independent variable does in fact influence the dependent variable. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples here. So selection effects, those are an example of one of them. One other example is called maturation effects, or the maturation confound. And essentially, what a maturation confound is whenever behavior changes naturally over time. So for example, let's say that I was to test children on math problems, and I was interested in whether or not they got better over a year. Well, the problem here is that, yeah, they are going to get better, and they are going to get faster at solving math problems, but they're also getting more developmentally sophisticated, and because of that, the math capabilities of a 5-year-old versus a 6-year-old is very, very big, even if that 6-year-old doesn't have the same amount of training, right? So just as a matter of course, people can get better and faster at solving quantitative problems like math. And so that is a behavior that changes naturally over time. Another example would be depression. That, as some of us know, there are some cases of depression that naturally get better with time. Maybe if it's situational, then gradually over time your situation changes and your depression gets better. But for some people it doesn't, right? And so the question then is, let's say that you come up with a drug and you give for depression, and you give people this drug, and you find that most people that took this drug, they did show better signs of losing depression. How can you be sure then that that is because of the drug and not because we know that some symptoms of depression get better over time? The solution here is to essentially come up with control groups. So you have one group that is going to be not on that drug and one group that is on that drug, and then you measure them both across time. Another is going to be the history confound. History confound is going to be looking at how historical events are going to affect our behavior. So it's kind of, we're talking about this in a very particular time in our society, right? So we're talking about this as of this time of recording in kind of self-quarantine measures. So if I were to look at, for example, how stressed out you are, we know that there are things that are happening that are going to affect that we're not measuring, right? That if I believed, just for example, I think that students are less stressed out whenever, or more stressed out at the end of the semester. You know, I can't say that right now, right? Because the beginning of the semester is very different than the end of the semester for us, right? Now, typically stress does seem to rise towards the end of the semester, but now we can't even compare it with the beginning of the semester or even last semester because we have this historical confound. We have something happening in our society that is potentially changing that dynamic, that relationship. So the solution here would be to essentially come up with a control group that happens on a different timeline. All right. So, and by timeline, I just mean like that would happen maybe a couple months later. Another confound is what's called regression to the mean, and this is in regards to statistical validity. The textbook talks about statistical validity. We're not going to go into too much detail about it in this video series or in this chapter, to be honest with you. We're going to talk about it more at the end of the semester when we start talking about statistics. But what regression is a statistical concept. And it's the idea that if you test somebody, you might get some extreme values. So let's say that you're doing this pasta study, and you give somebody a medium-sized bowl, and they are on a very strict diet. And so, or let's say you give somebody a very large bowl, and they're on a very strict diet, and they don't really eat all that much. If you just look at that one person, you might assume for your study that, oh, large bowls seem to actually make people eat less, right? But that would be incorrect. That would not be what the people actually found, right? And so you would need to test more people. As you test more people, those extreme values begin to go away. And that's what regression to the mean is. That as you collect more data, the more and the more data you collect, the more and more your data start to resemble the national average. Those extreme values become less influential. So, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to talk about here. The example that I gave here is like if you're measuring happiness and one of your subjects just won the lottery, they're super happy, right? And so you can't just rely on one person. You have to look at lots of people. So you would need to test lots of people, and eventually that one person being extremely happy is their effects are not going to influence the data that much in the grand scheme of things. Attrition confounds, if you have a pre-test and post-test setup, if you have a design like that, not everybody's going to complete the study. Not everybody's going to finish all the way through. And that's just natural, right? Maybe people drop out of school, maybe people stop being interested in participating, and so they no longer do. And so you need to make sure that whenever you have people that do fall off like that, that it's not because of any systematic reason. If you are measuring, for example, happiness, you might find that some people are, that the people who are in the post-test design are happier, right? And so it looks like, oh, okay, all right, let me flesh out this example. Let's say that you have a drug that you think, I've used drug too many times. Let's say that you believe that exercise makes people happy. And so you're going to implement an exercise routine where for the next 6 weeks, people have to run a 5K every week, okay? So that's what they have to do. And so you measure pre-test, you measure their happiness, and post-test, you measure their happiness again. You expect that the exercise is going to make them happier. You get your results and you find, yes, indeed, people that took the post-test did seem to be happier. So it looks like running 5Ks makes us happy, right? We can't say that, or at least we can't until we know more information. We need to know about if anybody discontinued the study. Was there anybody who just didn't want to follow up and they just quit doing it? Because if they did, that biases our post-test sample. We're probably going to find that the people that are unhappy are probably going to be the people that drop out of the study, right? So that we're only left with the happy people who are completing the study. And then we're not really looking at how exercise influences happiness, right? We're looking at how time weeds out unhappy people. Testing confounds. We there is a very common finding in psychology that people who are tested on something do best or do better whenever they're tested on it a second time. And so, for example, if I gave you a research methods exam, you took it, and then I let you take it again, you're going to do better the second time you take it, right? And that's true for most things in life, that the second time that we do it, we generally do better, even if we haven't even trained on something. Just by doing it again, we oftentimes are better. And I know you're already thinking of several times that that's not true, but just generally speaking, that is it's called the testing effect. It's a very common finding in psychology. And so, again, for us to make sure that this is not happening, we want to have very good control groups to make sure that if you're worried about the testing effect, that maybe the control group is not getting the same test twice, for example. The instrumentation confound, this is whenever you have a confound, or whenever the results are changing because how you're recording them changes. Your measuring instrument has changed. It has been altered in some way. Now, this can be mechanical. It can be the case that if you're weighing people, you're measuring how much they weigh, that becomes uncalibrated. That can affect the results, obviously. But more commonly, you have this happening to humans, where you have people who are observing data and they're writing and reporting that data down, and those researchers that are in charge of that, their own biases, their own kind of way that they classify behaviors changes slightly over time, and that can impact behavior. Otherwise, maybe let's say you have a lab and your researcher is very friendly to participants at the beginning of the semester and then not so friendly towards the end of the semester. That is an example of a human instrumentation confound, where your researcher is changing their behavior and the way they record, the way they interact with the with the participants over time. So the way that we would want to fix that is to look for good post-test designs to make sure that there's ways you can calibrate or train or reconfigure those measurements. Diffusion confounds, these are whenever participants just talk amongst themselves and talk about what other participants might be able to expect. We know that people who know what to expect coming in can change their own behavior, and that can change what you're looking for. It can change. If it changes the behavior, then we're having problems with internal validity. You're not able to accurately say that what you're measuring is in fact what you think you're measuring because of these diffusion confounds. And finally, we have external validity. This is a problem that is another balancing act. We want to try to make sure that what we are measuring in the laboratory setting is indeed reflected in the real world, that it is something that other people have found, that or maybe I shouldn't say it that way. Yeah, you can say it that way, but make sure that this is behavior as most people probably experience it. One of the reasons why I like that pasta bowl experiment is because they had people come into a cafeteria and serve themselves pasta. That is something that you do at lunch, right? Imagine if you walked into a laboratory and they gave you a bowl and then had you select pasta in this laboratory setting. It's probably not going to be realistic, right? That doesn't really reflect real-world eating, because how often do you eat in a sterile laboratory, right? Not very often. So this is, like I said, a balancing act, because oftentimes what happens is that the more you control something, the less externally valid it is, the less like real life it becomes. The less you control it, though, or maybe to frame it a different way, the more like real life it becomes that you're measuring, the less controlled you are. So you have to strike this balance. You want to try to make sure that what you're doing is both internally valid and externally valid, but if you have too much of one, it can definitely influence the other in a negative way. Alright, so that's all that I want to talk about for this video. The next video, we're gonna cap this off by talking about within subject designs, which are another kind of experiment. So far we've been talking about between groups. Let's look at the other side. Coming up next.